So let me tell you a story, Leonardo. Recently, I read something about the oldest cadmium yellow pigment sample in recorded history, made by Winsor and Newton in 1851, proudly shown off at the Crystal Palace exhibition. But then, my brain did what it always does. Hang on, cadmium was discovered in 1817, so why the hell does the first proper pigment only appear 34 years later? 34 years in pigment history isn't a delay. It's a geological epoch, and just when you think the timeline makes sense, someone, let's call him a chemistry influencer of the 1830s, drops a curveball. Ferdinand Runge produced cadmium yellow 15 years earlier, in a book, as swatches, printed for everyone to admire, the 1830s equivalent of a viral TikTok. Or did he? Because the closer you look, the more this shifts from pigment history into something with far more drama. Is this the biggest F-up in cadmium history? Let's rewind. Ferdinand Runge, brilliant, eccentric, a little too obsessed with colours for someone who didn't actually work in colour production. This is the man who discovered aniline and phenol because he was bored distilling coal tar. The man who impressed Goethe by dilating a cat's pupil with atropine. The man who invented protochromatography in his kitchen, like he was cooking psychedelic pancakes. He even worked in the intellectual orbit of Stromeyer, the man who discovered cadmium, and clearly absorbed enough chemistry to be dangerous. Runge wasn't stupid, he wasn't malicious. He was something more volatile, a misunderstood genius with something to prove. Academia didn't want him. Industry dismissed him. Society never really knew what to do with him. So if Van Meegeren forged Vermeers to shout, "See, I told you I was brilliant," Runge may have done the 1830s equivalent, fake a colour swatch to show he could make the future, and master the past, not out of malice, out of ambition, insecurity, and chemical enthusiasm. Here's where the story snaps. When you analyse Runge's cadmium yellow using modern techniques, which you've just done and published, something awkward lands on the table. There is no cadmium. None. Zero. Not even a whisper. Instead, the swatches contain lead chromate, copper chromate, phases, iron compounds, ochres, zinc minerals, everything except cadmium. Remember that in 1830 there was no XRF, no Raman, no ICP-MS. Chemistry barely had a periodic table. Periodic, you mean alphabetic, and in which language? German, French, English, total chaos. So what was Runge thinking? Probably this: no one will ever know. Forward thinking cuts both ways. He imagined a future where colour science mattered, and a future where his little substitution would never be exposed. Until now. Because you tested the actual paint, not the legend, not the citation, not the assumption. And there is no cadmium. None, which means either Runge made a spectacular mistake or a spectacular decision. Either way, a quiet footnote in pigment history just became a 189-year mystery. So why would Runge do this? Because his entire life sat on the border between recognition and oblivion. He impressed Goethe, but never got a professorship. He discovered aniline and phenol, and was told by his bosses to stop wasting time. He created the first synthetic dye before Perkin, and received absolutely nothing for it. He lived in a space where inventiveness becomes insecurity, and insecurity becomes performance. So when he printed a book filled with luminous colour swatches, a book meant to show the world he mattered, is it really shocking that one of those colours wasn't what he claimed? Is that fraud? Or a man trying to survive his own obscurity? Sometimes, Leonardo, society doesn't create criminals, it creates people who are tired of being invisible, and that is the real lesson here. Once you accept there's no cadmium, the story collapses beautifully. Historians sidelined his claim. Chemists mentioned it as a curiosity. Pigment researchers treated his books like treasure chests of early materials. But now? Now we know Runge's cadmium yellow never existed. Not in paint, not in a jar, not in any chemical record, only on paper. In a book he privately printed, in colours nobody could test for 189 years, in a format that looked authoritative only because he wanted it to. And everyone believed it, not because it was convincing, but because no one bothered to check the material. Here's the twist, Leonardo. Everyone assumed the earliest real cadmium yellow was the Winsor and Newton sample from the 8th of March, 1851. But while digging into Runge's claim, you uncovered something even earlier. 2 immaculate Reeves & Sons watercolour blocks, each one literally engraved with February 3rd, 1851. Chemically pure, compositionally perfect, and older than Winsor and Newton's by more than a month. This is now the oldest verified cadmium sulfide pigment ever documented. And suddenly, the whole timeline finally makes sense. 1817, cadmium discovered. 1830s, Runge claims cadmium yellow, but he doesn't have it. 3rd of February, 1851. Reeves & Sons produce the real thing. 8th of March, 1851. Winsor and Newton produce theirs. 2025. Runge's claim collapses under modern analysis. You didn't just fix a date, Leonardo. You corrected the history of an entire pigment. So what do we do with Runge? Do we mock him, expose him, dismiss him? No, because Runge wasn't Van Meegeren. He wasn't gaming the system for profit. He wasn't malicious. He was trying to teach, to inspire, and maybe, just maybe, to finally be seen. If he cheated one colour in one ambitious book, perhaps it wasn't deception. Perhaps it was the only language he had left. From this point on, let's call it what it actually is. Runge's yellow, not cadmium, but a pigment with a human story baked into it. For 189 years, Runge's cadmium yellow drifted through history unchallenged. A quirky anecdote, a repeated footnote, a story everyone assumed was true. And then you ask the most important question in science. Is this actually true? One measurement later, and the entire myth dissolves. Runge's yellow wasn't cadmium, not a trace, which means the true first cadmium yellow belongs to Reeves & Sons. 3rd February 1851. Documented, verified, finally recognised. And the deeper lesson? Across history, countless people, men and women, have had their contributions bent, buried, overshadowed, or overwritten. Just ask Watson and Crick. Not always by malice, sometimes just by inertia. This time, the truth was recovered, because someone finally checked the chemistry, and that someone was you. This story didn't even make it into my book, which tells you how many pigment disasters are still hiding in the archives. But now that I've checked Runge's yellow and watched it fall apart like a Victorian confidence trick, I realise something. The past isn't stable. It changes every time we measure it properly. If you want the myths I did publish, and the ones I couldn't fit, you know where to look.